I apologize. I will start again. This session is being recorded, by the way. Once again, I'd like to thank all of you for joining the last session for the 2018-2019 Agile Maine season. We had a lot of great sessions. We've had a lot of great speakers, and I hope all of you have gotten something out of that. All right. Oh, you okay?
No.
Okay. So I was going to hit the space. Thank you. You good? Okay. So my name is James Morse. I'm going to be doing the announcements, and I'll also be doing the introductions tonight. So before we get started, I'd like to recognize our sponsors, ProSearch, Elysian Group, TD, and Seaglass Technology Partners. They're the ones responsible for the pizza and the wonderful drinks we have for the session. I'd also like to thank IDEX for providing the facility for tonight's meeting. If you or your company would like to be a sponsor or even host an Agile Maine session, please send an email off to communications@agilemaine.com, and a member of the board will reach out to you to make the appropriate arrangements. Upcoming classes. We have 2 Scrum Academy classes coming up, Product Owner Track and Scrum Master Track. Both these are going to be a series of 6 half-day sessions, meeting every 2 weeks over a 12-week period. They are going to be facilitated by Kevin Callahan. If you'd like some additional information on those sessions, please go to agilemaine.com, check out our events page, or you can just hook up with Kevin at the end of the session. We also have a Leading in Complexity course coming up in September. These are going to be 2 full-day courses, also facilitated by Kevin Callahan. Again, there's more information on agilemaine.com/events. We also have a late addition onto this, Professional Scrum with Kanban. I believe, Yuval, is this your session? It'll be from October 21st to 22nd. There will be some additional information coming out on that, and Yuval will also be talking about that a little bit towards the end of his presentation. Oops. Okay, the next meetup will be at WEX in September. That'll be the first session that kicks off our 2019-2020 Agile Maine season. The speaker is going to be Richard, let me get this right, Richard Kasparowski. Richard is an author, teacher, speaker, and coach focused on team building and high-performance teams. He did have a session at the 2018 Agile Maine Day Conference. If you did miss his session, please check out the Agile Maine's YouTube channel for the recording of that session. This September date is to be determined. Please keep a lookout on our website for the date. I believe Diane will also send out an email as we get closer to that date on when it's going to occur. And finally, I'd like to introduce Yuval Yeret. Let's see, Yuval is a professional Scrum trainer and Safe Program Consultant Trainer at Agile Sparks. He is known as Mr. Kanban Israel and currently resides in the Boston area. He's a steward of the Professional Scrum with Kanban class and Kanban for Scrum Teams guide at scrum.org. He's a frequent speaker at industry conferences. He is also the recipient of the Lean Kanban Brickell Key Award. Tonight's topic is Scrum, Kanban, and DevOps, sitting in a tree, leveraging Kanban and DevOps to improve Scrum. We're honored to have him here tonight. Please help me welcome him.
It is now?
Yep.
So the recording would start now. Should be okay? Cool. I typically don't need a mic, so maybe you haven't noticed. So should we use Scrum or should we use Kanban? So the people that raised their hands for both Scrum and Kanban, are you using them together or are you using Scrum for some things and Kanban for other things? How many of you are using them separately? How many of you are actually mixing them together? Yes, the other visitor from Boston is mixing them together. Yes, but not calling them Scrum or Kanban, which is a different story. Yeah, so that's very common. So a common thing we see in the industry is this discussion that goes like, we use Scrum for product development because it's complex work, and we use Kanban for maintenance, reactive work, for the teams that cannot really do Scrum. Is that the kind of definition that you're following? So we actually, in Scrum.org, we actually see it as a myth. As something, and if you look at the history, you will see that this is actually something that Scrum practitioners have used during the rise of Kanban to basically protect their turf. And it's understandable. Kanban started to become more popular. One way to fight it would be to say Kanban is rubbish, it wouldn't work. Another way would be to say Kanban is great for that other thing. You know, don't touch our product development teams. And a lot of people heard that in Scrum training and from Scrum practitioners and in meetups, even from leaders in the Scrum communities. Even leaders related to Scrum.org commented like this. So it took a while to start to build a bridge. But a couple of years ago, around 2 years ago, we started to actually build a bridge between the Kanban community and the Scrum community. And this is what this talk is about Scrum and Kanban sitting on a tree together, figuring out how to actually take advantage of both the empiricism and rhythm of Scrum and all the good things that Scrum brings with it, as well as flow that Kanban brings. So yeah, you can use Kanban for reactive teams, and it's a great solution for those teams. But I've been using Kanban for product development since around 2007, both as a practitioner, leading an R&D group with several teams that use Kanban to build an embedded storage networking product, as well as working with clients all over the place in Israel and here on the West Coast that we're using Kanban in those environments as well. So Kanban isn't just for maintenance. Kanban deals with complex environments as well. Is it the best solution for a complex environment on its own? One of the things that I actually regret, if I look at the clients that I worked with, is one financial tech company in Israel. They were working on creating a bank-to-bank solution for the Australian banks networks, or network of banks. And they decided to go pure Kanban. They had a couple of teams working together as part of a big program, strategic program. They were using Kanban. They started to achieve flow. But when I reflected on what they were able to achieve and what kind of was missing there after a while, the main thing that was missing was rhythm, was cadence, was time boxing, was the fact that we didn't have a clear product owner. We had something like a product owner, but sprints and having a sprint review and some forcing function for an increment at the end of every couple of weeks, that was something that was missing there. So I started to realize that Kanban isn't an alternative or shouldn't be an alternative to Scrum. We should find ways to bring them together. Another thing we hear often and see often in the field is we don't need Scrum anymore. We evolved. We're post-Scrum. We're modern Agile. We're Kanban. It's easier to do Kanban. I actually hear it a lot in the marketing space. So a lot, a kind of a hobby for me these days is to work with marketing teams on achieving agility as well. They're kind of new to this thing. It's where we were like 10 years ago, kind of fresh. And believe, you would not be surprised to hear that they say, oh, Scrum is for those developers. It's hard to have all that discipline. Developers and testers, they are the disciplined people. We cannot work with those processes. So Kanban is a better fit for us. It's hard to finish something every couple of weeks. Yeah, it's hard. To do Kanban well is hard as well. How many of you are limiting WIP if you're using Kanban? Yeah, far fewer people than the people that said they were using Kanban. So you're not using Kanban. I could ask the same question about Scrum. What's the kind of question that we should ask about Scrum that is like the do we limit WIP when we use Kanban? Anybody have an idea? Yeah. What's your sprint goal? That's one good question. Do you even have a sprint goal? Okay. Why is it important to have a sprint goal in Scrum? Because at the end, you know if you've met it. Why else? Yes, you're focused. One of the Scrum values is focus. And another thing it helps with is with agility. The goal of Scrum is to provide you with the agility to actually optimize the value that you can deliver in the sprint. We're talking about empiricism, inspect and adapt, welcome changes to optimize the value for the customer. That applies within a sprint as well. But how does it work if we have a sprint which we plan? How do we adjust during the sprint? That's where the sprint goal comes in. Because if you read the Scrum Guide, which is a recommended practice every couple of years at least for any Agile practitioner, you would see that nothing says there that the sprint backlog cannot change during the sprint. The sprint goal should not change during the sprint. If it really is obsolete, you could cancel the sprint. But if the sprint goal is still relevant, but you've learned of something different that you might do in the sprint to better meet the sprint goal, go ahead and do it. But if you don't have a sprint goal, how would you be able to know what makes sense as a change direction and what doesn't? One of the interesting things that happen when we start to talk about Kanban is each one of the Kanban elements actually has, what's the term when you have cities that are sister cities or neighbor? Does Portland have a sister city somewhere in the world? That's probably not the term. Yeah. So I think Jaffa in Israel has LA as its Boston and Haifa, yes. So there's something in Kanban. A lot of the things in Kanban have some sister cities in Scrum. So limiting WIP in Kanban, limiting work in process or work in progress, we still have this argument in the Scrum.org community. Could be another meetup session altogether. If you really want to hear about it, ask me about it later on, why choose one or the other. Limiting work in process. In Kanban, that's like a core practice, making sure that you're not working on too many things at the same time. It's also a core practice in Scrum, although it's implicit. People don't really see it as that thing. But when they start to hear about Kanban, when they come to a Kanban class, some of them realize along the way, hey, wait, that sounds familiar. What in Scrum is like limiting work in process, making sure that we're not starting too many things and focusing on finishing them. So in a way, having an increment of potentially shippable or releasable software at the end of the sprint, that's something that focuses you and limits the amount of work in process that you have. There's something else.
Well, it's not in the Scrum Guide velocity, but the equivalent of that would just be the Scrum backlog.
So how is the sprint backlog a form of limiting work in process? How many things are there? Yeah, so if you look at a good Scrum team, they would, in their sprint planning, they would pull into the sprint just the right amount of work that they are confident that they can finish in the sprint. They would not pull in too much work into the sprint. So that's another time-based form of limiting work in process. Story sizing. Tell me more. Yes, and another thing that it helps you do is if you're sizing stories, or as we call it, right-sizing stories, you're making sure that you're limiting the amount of your work that you're pulling in. If the team has, a working agreement, listen, if something is bigger than a certain size for us, call it points, call it whatever, fruits, sizes of oysters, whatever you want to call it, we don't pull it in. If it's bigger than that, then that's a form of limiting work in process as well, right? So back to this team that has evolved to become a Kanban team. If they're not limiting WIP, then they're just copying out of continuous improvement and learning. They're just using Kanban as an excuse not to use Scrum. Those are the teams that really give the ammunition to those Scrum practitioners that say, yeah, Kanban isn't real agility. It's too easy. You just set up a board. You don't have to touch the roles in the organization. Okay, that's nice. You don't even have to go on a diet. So if I said I'm going on a diet, and I said, listen, I'm even going to limit my work in process. Let's say we're eating pizza here, right? I'm going to limit myself to the amount of slices that I eat every time I eat pizza. If I limit myself to 10 slices each time I eat pizza, I'm not going to go on too much of a diet, right? If I limit myself to only eating pizza 7 times a week, that's not going to be too much of a diet. Like my kiddo says, every day is pizza day, right? It's not going to be too much of a diet. So limiting WIP is not enough. You need to actually reduce the amount of work in process that you have as a team. It needs to be painful. If Kanban is easier, yeah, it might be easier. It shouldn't be too easy. If it's too easy, too comfortable, you're not challenging yourself enough, and you're not going to improve. So, we looked at it from the Kanban side and saw a lot of teams that are doing unprofessional Kanban, what we call, some people call it proto-Kanban. We looked at some people that use Scrum, but do Scrum and focus more on, story size estimation and how exactly to do sprint planning, and that's what they were inspecting and adapting, and they weren't actually inspecting and adapting their product. And we saw a lot of bad stuff going out there. Scrum theater, Kanban theater, Agile theater, Scrumful, whatever you want to call it, a lot of bad stuff was going on, and we got together and said, okay, let's try to drive some change. Bring people from the Kanban community and the Scrum community and do something about this. The first thing we did was write a guide. Are you familiar with the Scrum Guide? Have you read the Scrum Guide? How many of you have read the Kanban Guide? And now I'm realizing that I forgot 50 copies of it in my car. So I'll bring it over at some point. So we wrote the Kanban Guide for Scrum teams. Familiar in, similar in structure to the Scrum Guide. What's the theory? What are the practices? The metrics, how does it impact Scrum? It doesn't change Scrum. I'll give you, a scoop on it. It doesn't change Scrum. But you start to do some of the Scrum elements differently using Kanban, and this is what the guide is about. So one of the first things we talk about in the guide, unsurprisingly, is in order to improve the flow, you need to understand the flow, to make the flow transparent. In order to inspect something, you need to first see it, achieve transparency. So the best way that we know of to make flow transparent is use a Kanban board. There are other ways. You don't have to use a Kanban board, but set up a Kanban board. Now that we have this Kanban board in place, and this team decided to visualize their sprint backlog, and then they have design and development and testing, and that's their process. Very nice process. A lot of people, especially Scrum trainers, by the way, professional Scrum trainers like Chris over there in the back, they see this. And they get the rush from seeing this slide. What's the problem with this slide? They feel like it's waterfall. Is it waterfall? Well, actually, in this case, it is. It's waterfall within a sprint. What's going on here? I mean, there are two things that kind of worry people as they look at it. They worry me as well. The sequence of steps that we see here, it's a sequence of steps. It's kind of a waterfall between the idea of doing something or having it in the sprint backlog, designing it, then developing, then testing it, then it's done. That's kind of a waterfall, but that's not the problem with waterfall. What's the big problem that we're facing with waterfall? Why is waterfall a bad solution or a non-ideal solution for complex work? Changing requirements is one problem. Slow feedback. Late feedback because of batch size. Yes, I heard batch size there. So what we see here is a tsunami going through the Kanban board. It's not a waterfall, it's a tsunami. They designed everything, then everything was ready, and then they kind of pushed it over the wall to development, to themselves, and now they're pushing it over the wall to testing. Does that sound like waterfall? It does sound like waterfall to me. But is it because they're using Kanban? No, the Kanban board is just like a sniffer, a debugger, showing them how they're working. It's actually increasing the chance that they will do something about it. What's the thing that might help them do something about it that we don't see in this board? WIP limits, work in process limits. Work in process limits that actually create some tension here are the thing that separates this from being just a Kanban board that is visualizing and making transparent a waterfall process, and actually starting to make this more of a river than a tsunami. So first practice in Kanban with Scrum is visualize your workflow, visualize the flow of work, make it transparent. The second practice is limit and reduce your work in process. If you don't do these two, you're not really using Kanban. I would actually say that limiting work in process in a proactive, meaningful way is more important than the visualization itself. If you find a way to understand how work is flowing, using cumulative flow diagrams, whatever way you find to visualize your flow and limit it, that's more important than whether you use a Kanban board or not. Kanban boards are great, they're cool, they're easy to use, but you don't have to use them. It's easy to use them these days, but you don't have to use them in order to use a Kanban-based flow system. So those were the first two practices that we talk about. The next one is, okay, we started to visualize the work and limit work in process. It's not enough. We need to start to actively manage the flow, the items that are in progress. And we'll talk more about some ideas for that. When would be, if you're using Scrum, when would be the prime time for you to actually do this, actively manage the items in progress? Let's see if this is scrum.org or Scrum Alliance down. Yes, where would you do this? During the daily Scrum? Scrum or stand-up? Who says daily Scrum? Who says daily stand-up? This is a Scrum Alliance town. We should work on that. Daily Scrum. In the Scrum guide, it's daily Scrum. Why is Scrum and not stand-up? You don't have to stand up. You normally stand up, but you don't have to. It's more respectful to say daily Scrum. Yeah? Why else? It's another thing to argue about. That's an important reason to have something to argue about. Chris, any other reason? It comes? The daily stand-up comes from XP, yeah. The daily Scrum comes from the source of Scrum, right? Where is Scrum coming from? Where is the term coming from? From rugby. What is the Scrum in rugby? It's like the huddle to try and take control of the ball, right? Okay, so in the daily whatever, I would prefer to use daily Scrum. I still respect you if you stick to daily stand-up. We actively manage the items in progress. Principle 4 is to inspect and adapt your workflow, not just your product, not just your definition of done as Scrum teams do, but let's be very explicit that we want to understand and improve our workflow using empiricism. Where would you do that? Mainly the retrospective, yes. At least we agree on the fact that everybody agrees that it's called retrospective. Not everybody agrees that you should do it. A lot of Scrum teams don't really use a retrospective anymore. Dave West from Scrum.org has a nice story about things he hears from teams about retrospectives, but you'll have to invite him over to hear it. He loves to go around and talk about things. So these are the 4 principles of using Kanban in a Scrum context. Anything that you're missing, if you're familiar with Kanban? Pooling. So pooling is not mentioned explicitly here, but through the fact that we're limiting and reducing work in progress, we're actually creating a pool system. Okay. So how would we actually go about actively managing the items in progress? So let's start to talk about some flow metrics. So a key metric that Kanban teams look at is cycle time. What do we mean by cycle time? A team can actually have multiple cycle times that they look at. One cycle time could be from the moment we actually start to work on something to the moment that it's in production. That's one cycle time. Another cycle time could be from the moment we start to refine something to the moment that it's in production. That would be a longer cycle time. Which one should we choose? Some people call that lead time. We prefer to just call them different cycle times. Which one should we focus on? The quicker one? Why?
Because if you break it down to the smallest size possible, like a building block, you can add building blocks to see how much big time you'll have.
So let me take it further. So you're saying let's focus just on from the moment we start the sprint or start working on the product backlog item to the moment it's done, instead of starting to look at cycle time from the moment we start to refine it.
I would actually say each step.
Each step. So if you just measure the cycle time for each step, what might be a benefit of doing that? That you have more visibility to the flow, right? What might be an undesirable side effect of looking at those separate cycle times? Too much?
Too much time focusing on how long it's taking you instead of that.
So too many metrics, that's one problem with it. What's another potential problem?
I think you're getting at Lean, you're going to talk about attack time. And attack time is the end-to-end. That's just a very simple way to tell what your overall flow rate is.
So I'm not an expert on lean manufacturing, okay? My understanding of takt time in lean manufacturing is that it's more similar to our cadence in Scrum. Because in manufacturing, in some manufacturing contexts at least, the way I understand it, you could actually have like a rhythm that says, okay, I'm working on something, then there's like a gong, everybody moves their stuff, everybody's aligned to, I don't know, everybody has a station in which they work a minute on something, then it's ready, we can move things over and we can work on a rhythm. The takt time. Doesn't work that well in our environment because there's this nasty thing called variability and complexity. We can't really use takt time. And when we talk about cycle times, you can actually see here, and we'll see a bigger version of this chart later on, that we can't really have the same cycle time on all of our product backlog items. Even if they're right size, similarly sized, there would be some variance. Even if we have a great Scrum team, they would probably not have the same what every sprint? Velocity or throughput. What is throughput in Kanban or in flow metrics? Throughput is very similar to velocity, but we typically don't care about the sizes of items. A team's throughput would be, let's say I have a team that is working together for a couple of sprints now. They could talk about their velocity and say, yeah, our velocity has been, 20, and in one sprint, 34 points, or ideal days, whatever, 25. When we talk about throughput, what they'll say is probably something along the lines of, in sprint 5, we've done 10 PBIs. In sprint 6, we've done 9 PBIs. In sprint 7, we've done 11 PBIs. And most teams actually predict better when they're looking at their throughput, just counting items, rather than basing it on their estimation approach, which is shocking to us as Agile practitioners. What does it mean? It means we should take story points and take them off for a nice, goodbye tour from the harbor and drop them with a very heavy anchor somewhere at sea. That's what it means about story points. It doesn't mean we don't need to estimate our work. We still estimate our work if we use throughput. But what does the estimation look like? It's right sizing. It's just making sure that items are small enough to be items that we could pull into our process. That's all. We don't have to worry too much about, is it a 2 or a 3 or a 5? We don't finish the sprint and worry about is our velocity like this or like that, and how many points do we take forward and how many points do we allow, and all of that discussion in retrospective gives me the creeps when teams do that. Yes?
So you're saying the PBI should be relatively the same size?
Ideally, yes. Ideally, they should be not. So, yes and no. Ideally, yes. But it's enough that they're small enough to fit the sprint. And if you do have some variation, I would say you could, say some of our items are very small, a certain, type of work. And if we have some items that are slightly bigger, we can have a different type of work that we use, which is a sort of estimation. But typically, and you could say, yeah, that's like having green for 1 story points and having gray for 8 story points. But something about the different way we manage this process of estimation and, give teams permission to stop worrying too much about the estimation and this aspect of sprint planning, frees team up to focus on better stuff, on actually inspecting and adapting their product and their process, their real process, not just the estimation process. So cycle time, again, cycle time typically cycle time doesn't care about the size of the work. Your cycle time might be, I don't know, what might be your cycle time if you are running a 2-week sprint? What would you expect to see as a cycle time for a Scrum team that is using a 2-week sprint? Let's talk about this team. What would be the cycle time for this team, assuming that they're running a 2-week sprint? Around 2 weeks for most of the items. Is that good? Probably not.
Is that from refinement to end, or are you saying start a sprint? Because if you're planning a sprint in advance, you start.
So if you're using cycle time and you're taking into account refinement, it would probably be more like 3 to 4 weeks. You're right. But let's say we're just using this sort of process. Yeah, it will be around 2 weeks. Is that a good cycle time for a team that is using 2-week sprints? Not really. What would you like to see as a good cycle time for a team that is starting to actually use Kanban, limiting their work in process within a 2-week sprint? Less than a week. That would be nice. If I can see an average of a week or something like, we use a term called service level expectation. It's a very complicated term. We are 2 stewards that take care of the professional Scrum Kanban guide and the class. Daniel Vacanti, who's one of the original creators of Kanban back in the Corbis days, and myself. He claims that I came up with this service level expectation term. I have no clue what he's talking about, but okay, I'll take credit for it. So this term, what it means is, as a team, we should set up some expectation from ourselves. This expectation might help us actually manage our flow. So if we are a team and we're looking at our flow and we're saying, yeah, we want to see most of our work finished within a week, what we'll say is, listen, our service level expectation from ourselves is that, say, 85% of our PBIs finish within 7 calendar days. That would be a form of a service level expectation. Ideally, that's connected to some data that shows that this is possible for the team, because we see that, it's a range that actually makes sense. Saying this is our service level expectation where 85% of our items actually take 2 weeks or more, that's a nice expectation, that's a nice aspiration. It's not that realistic at the moment. we should work towards that direction. So throughput, cycle time, and one thing that helps us actually improve our cycle times is work item aging. A lot of you are probably familiar with cycle time. A lot of you are probably familiar with work in process as a, at least a limitation, but also a metric that we use a cumulative flow diagram to look at. But have you heard of work item aging? A few of you have. Some of you may be using this sort of metric on your Kanban boards, especially if you're advanced Jira users. You might be using that already without knowing that's the name. But let's continue a bit and then get back to it. So another myth that we see a lot out there is that Scrum includes story points, burndowns, and tasks. So we've already buried at sea story points. What's my problem with burndowns and tasks? So So how many of you are using burndowns? What's your unit on the y-axis of your burndowns? Tasks, hours. Oh, it gets worse. Story point is actually a reasonable way to do a burndown. If you're doing it that way, you have a half blessing for me. If you're using tasks, if you're using hours, what? Yes, something like that. You could count tasks, it's better than hours, but there's still a problem. What does this burndown show us? No, it's the actual burndown from a team. It's the actual burndown from that waterfall team. I mean, it's not, but it could be. A believably bad Scrum could have a perfect looking burndown chart. So it's not helping us see whether Scrum is working well for that team or not. All it's helping us is if we have a tendency to need to feel in control of what's going on, and we have a past of, using hours and work breakdown structures and a feeling we need to see the remaining effort on something, this makes us feel cozy. I'm also a safe trainer, okay? Don't throw the tomatoes. But a lot of people, when I, meet people in the Scrum community, they say, yeah, safe, helps people feel comfortable with what they're doing. It has a role that is like a role in the organization. You could kind of do things the way you do right now. I disagree with that, okay? There's some sense in that. I do disagree with it. Maybe, in another talk, another year. But it's the same thing that burndowns do and tasks and remaining effort do. They make managers and project managers feel comfy. Feel that, we haven't gone through a real change. It kind of hides the fact that we're not really, or it keeps them focused on remaining work and not about empiricism. So I hate burndown charts. I actually don't think that a team that is working for 2 weeks needs a burndown chart to see what's going on. A Kanban board, even a Scrum task board, is good enough to see what's going on. A burndown chart doesn't really add that much more value. It focuses you on the wrong things, and it's just a complementary practice in Scrum. It's not part of Scrum. You don't have to use burndowns. When you use Scrum, you don't have to use tasks. For sure, you don't have to track remaining effort on tasks, which, I don't know. I've been a developer in my past. I didn't like to do it. I haven't met too many developers that like to track remaining effort on tasks. Even those that like to do it don't really predict well how much remaining effort they have on their tasks. So this is kind of a bean counting activity that doesn't relate to Agile. Let's get rid of it. Let's send it on the same boat as the story points. Instead, in our daily Scrum, and sorry, the slide is about daily Scrum and not daily stand-up, let's focus on the flow of work. Let's tell a story in the daily Scrum from the PBI's perspective, the product backlog items perspective. So let's walk the board right to left, Hebrew mode, and through the fact that we're starting with things that are closest to the finish line, it reinforces pull. It reinforces finishing things before starting things. And we don't have to talk about everything. Let's focus on the things that, have some issues. Let's talk about impediments to flow, bottlenecks, blockers. Let's talk about black bananas. This is a legendary team. So think about it this way. What should we want to focus on in our daily Scrum? Blocked items, impediments. Yes, those are the first things to talk about and find ways to do something. Adjust, adapt our plan for the next day in order to resolve those impediments, get rid of the blockers. But what if people are not blocked? They're making very slow progress, or in their perception, they're not blocked, they're actually blocked. How would we know what to focus on? That's a common problem. So this genius of a team, they said, you know what, when we start to work on an item, let's put on some banana peel, staple some banana peel to the card on the board. And, most of our items, if we really finish stuff within a couple of days, they'll make it all the way to the finish line looking, I don't know, like this, maybe even better. No smell or nice banana peel smell. But some items, maybe they're not blocked, but they're black. And they're smelling. We want to get rid of those. So the moment Jira, not just Jira, the moment our tools, our touch screens would be able to convey smell, that's the first feature I'll ask for. But at the time, for now, we just need to look at the right visualization on our boards that kind of highlights items that are aging too much. Whether you use a fancy analytics-based board like the one here from Actionable Analytics, Daniel's tool, whether you use something in Linkit that shows this, or whether you use the Jira feature that shows you more dots on the card, the more time it spends in your process active. Whatever you do, that should be one of the highlights of a daily Scrum. One of the first things you focus on. Yes?
Why are you so worried about how long it takes to complete something when you also have the option to set in that item?
Because, that's a good question. Thank you. So the reason we're worried about how long it takes us to complete something is that if it takes the longer it takes us to complete something, the longer the feedback loop. I don't care about if it's due or not. That's not the reason here. I hopefully start something close to the time, reasonably close to the time that it's due, so it won't sit on the shelf and rot. But the main problem is, when I was a developer, when I wrote, some Linux kernel code, file system kernel code, even user space code, and I couldn't get feedback on that code for a couple of weeks, I knew that if there was a problem there, I would probably get it as, there's some problem, We don't know what's causing it because we're testing dozens of change sets at a time. Fix it. And I don't know where it is. I've moved on. My head, even in those days that I was a developer, maybe I was just a bad developer, but it wasn't perfect. I didn't remember everything that I was doing. So the longer it takes you until you close the feedback loop on something, whether it's the testing feedback loop, whether it's the market feedback loop, whether it's the product owner looking at something, all of those feedback loops, they grow less and less effective the longer they are. So if we talk about empiricism, the core of Scrum, the heart of Scrum is empiricism. Transparency through working software, inspecting it and adapting based on that feedback. There's one extra thing that isn't mentioned as part of transparency, inspection, and adaptation, and that is what's the length of our feedback loop? How long does it take us to close it? Everybody has a feedback loop. Eventually you learn whether your software sucks or not. But you're much more effective if you learn quickly. Whether your requirements are really required by the market, if people find your software useful. If you're building good code, if you're designing good code. So we want a tight feedback loop. And tight feedback loop is what we achieve through tight cycle times, even within the sprint. The tighter the cycle times within the sprint, the better your process as a Scrum team, the less waste you have in your process. The faster you swarm and deal with those black bananas, aging work, the faster your cycle times overall will be. So if you want to look at it as a progression, it's like I'm not an expert on diets, but it's like saying the first step would be to avoid eating really horrible food. That would be like limiting work in process. That would be the first step. Don't eat in McDonald's. Don't eat fast food, okay? Sorry if there are any McDonald's fans in here. The second step would be, okay, that got us better. That improved our cycle times. The second step would be to start to actually manage the flow of things and look for, okay, we limited work in process, but some items are still black. Yeah. So let's focus on those. That's the second step. That would be like maybe starting to measure calories on things or going on a detox, whatever.
Question for you.
Yes.
The feedback loop in Scrum is the sprint.
That's one feedback loop in Scrum.
Okay, so where are we bringing the customer into the piece in this model right here? If the stakeholders are coming in for this sprint review, we're trying to condense that feedback loop to a day or two. So are you creating additional ceremonies?
So, good question. So we don't necessarily create additional events, but the team needs to look at their workflow and kind of weigh two things. Weigh how important to us is it to get feedback not just from testing, maybe not just from our product owner, but also from other stakeholders. If it's really important to us to have this sort of feedback, yeah, let's invite them along the way, maybe not as a ceremony, but let's try to be as close to our business people as possible. The most effective way is to have daily interactions between developers and business people. Yeah, that's true. A lot of, in some cases it makes sense. In some cases it doesn't make sense because the transaction cost of getting to the business people is a bit too high. They're not as interested in coming every couple of days. And you're saying, you know what? We'll get feedback from our product owner as part of the cycle time within the sprint. We're okay with getting the stakeholders' feedback in the sprint review. Look at what kind of feedback you're getting. And weigh the cost of the late feedback versus the cost of getting the stakeholders more frequently. One way to look at it would be to say, let's look at how much uncertainty and complexity do we have on our product, what we're doing right now. If it's reasonable, maybe at the end of the sprint is good enough. But if you're the team trying to figure out how to fix Apollo 13, the cost of delay is so high that you'll want to talk to the stakeholders as soon as you have something. You won't wait an extra second for it. And some teams are dealing with this sort of situation. When that's the situation, I would say go sit next to your customers or bring the customers. Create a situation where everybody works together. But that's a good fit for certain types of contexts. Not all of the products in your organization, not all of your initiatives would require this intense level of empiricism and collaboration. So we kind of talked about using service level expectations, and this gives us an example for how to calculate those. So what we see here is that 85 of this data set of what happened in the last couple of months, what can we see here? We can see that each one of those is a PBI that finished. In some areas, there are a couple, so there's a number. 3 items that finished here. And what we can see here is that, okay, we have a lot of data, a lot of items finished. The range of cycle time is anywhere between 2 and 45, let's say, 42. But that's not as useful. But something that is more useful is to say, you know what? 85% of those cards actually took 16 days or less. Now this starts to be interesting. Now this isn't a very good Scrum team, or you could say that their sprint is 30 days long. This can reflect a team that has a sprint of 30 days. But now they can say, okay, based on all of this history, empiric evidence, we could set a service level expectation of 16 days with 85% confidence. And ideally, what they would say is, this is what we can expect from ourselves, but can we do better? Can we actually reduce this line, bring it lower? Because if we can say with a good level of confidence that we finish the items within 12 days, that's better. That's a faster feedback loop. So how could you improve it? You would start to look for black bananas. You would reduce your work in process. There's this sort of relationship between work in process and cycle time. If you reduce your work in process, potentially you can improve your average cycle time. That's what Little's law tells us. So you would have these sort of discussions in the retrospective, as you said, about how to inspect and adapt our workflow. We would look for black bananas and look at work item aging as part of our daily Scrum. We would use throughput, compare it to velocity, maybe at some point get rid of velocity. When? When would we look at throughput in order to help us forecast? Sprint planning, yeah. As well as sprint review. Sprint review, we would look at, how much we delivered, but sprint review should mainly be about the increment of working software and inspecting and adapting the product. Metrics can be interesting there. They're not the main event. So a couple of interesting metrics that could spice up your the way you do Scrum and help you think more about flow. And they fit into each one of the Scrum events. But Kanban in the context of Scrum is not just about the sprint. Yeah, we start with bringing flow into the sprint, but actually, in many teams, the flow problems are not in the sprint. For sure, they won't be in the sprint after you use Kanban well in the sprint and limit work in process. There might be flow problems in the refinement area. All of the product owners work with the team and prioritization and funding, whatever happens, until we get something ready for sprinting. And another area is everything that happens from the moment we say we're done. Because I'm guessing, how many of you actually include deploy as part of done? Some people. How many of you include, we looked at the telemetry that we have after deployment, reflected on it, inspected and adapted based on it as part of your definition of done? A couple of people. Chapeau. Nice. But most teams don't do that these days. For most teams, done is, yeah, it's shippable, releasable, not released. And that's understandable. But we don't want to forget about our work at that point. If, the cycle time from the moment we have something that is ready to be released and its actual release and delivering value is meaningful as well for empiricism. So we want to extend Kanban over time to look at the entire flow. And this is where we start to hear things like, no, we don't need Scrum. We're using DevOps. We're doing continuous delivery. We don't need Scrum. We're moving to Kanban. Or we don't even need Kanban because we're doing DevOps or continuous delivery. So another way to look at it would be to say, okay, if we look at the Kanban view of the typical way people look at their increments, again, we see a tsunami here, in a sense. They implement Agile within a sprint. So within a sprint, they, pull something from the backlog, they work on it, they get it done. And eventually they create, they move the whole sprint backlog into an increment, and that's something that you have at the end of the sprint. So sprint 2's increment is ready at the end of sprint 2, and then it's being deployed as an increment. So we have big increments being deployed. The typical scenario is actually that work stays here and accumulates, and only gets deployed as releases, not even sprints. So what we're shooting for, regardless of whether we're using Scrum or Kanban, is something that looks like this, where we have a continuous flow of very small increments that are each one program backlog item. So if we finished I, for example, we could deliver it, deploy it, learn from it, on its own. But in order to do that, we need first to be able to continuously integrate, to continuously deploy, to continuously learn. We need engineering practices that are aligned with this way of working. This isn't just about implementing Scrum or Kanban. This is dramatic change to your technical practices. This isn't just about hiring a DevOps engineer. This is about everybody implementing Agile, but then automating and automating and automating everything and changing the culture and figuring out how to still be compliant with Sarbanes-Oxley while we're doing continuous deployment, and legal challenges, technical challenges, a lot of challenges that we'll face along the way to actually creating this sort of flow. And another way to look at it is if you look at the 3 ways towards DevOps that Gene Kim from the Phoenix Project talks about. He talks about the first way is systems thinking. So Kanban and looking at the entire flow, that's systems thinking. We look at the entire system, our entire cycle time, not just cycle times of different steps. Working process limits across the entire system are a way to look at the entire system. The second way is to amplify feedback loops. We kind of covered that. How do we accelerate feedback loops? Through lower working process, actively managing the work, thereby tightening the average feedback loop, length of the feedback loop. And the third way is the culture of continual experimentation and learning. And that's what we continue to do to improve the flow here. So basically, by using Kanban and flow together with Scrum, we're implementing a DevOps culture. We're not implementing DevOps tools. That's not what this is about. This is about helping us align with the DevOps culture. And on the way, this will lead us towards changing some of the way we look at tooling, some of the roles in the organization. It will kind of raise the need to use some DevOps engineers and DevOps tools and DevOps continuous deployment practices. A lot of people see DevOps just, as a tool-focused thing. We see DevOps as a culture that is just, applying empiricism and flow, not just for the product dev test slice of the value stream, but all the way through operations, as well as, learning whether something is really providing value or not. If you want to learn more about all of these concepts and some other things that I didn't even mention, of course, go read the Kanban guide. I will go and bring over some copies if you want to stay a couple of minutes after 7, or just follow me to my car if you want a copy. We'll see. I have 57 copies. The other thing is, as we mentioned, there's the Professional Scrum with Kanban class, which is basically 2 days of exploring these topics and getting into the details of how to actually implement them and map the Kanban practices to Scrum, as well as learning about Kanban in depth, real Kanban, what it looks like. And our belief is that with the guide, with the class, basically what we're doing is helping people find this spot here of using Kanban done right together with professional Scrum to actually improve the way they work. And our mission with this, the Scrum.org mission, is to improve the profession of software development, improve the profession of building products, helping people to deal with complex problems. That's what we're trying to do. And I hope some of you will, and some of your friends will join me somewhere here in Portland. Maybe it will be here. Maybe it will be somewhere downtown. We still need to figure out what makes sense. If you're interested in your organization to host the class, we can talk about it as well. We'll do a Professional Scrum with Kanban class. It's currently on early bird, obviously, because it's far ahead. But if you use Maine Sparks 10, you can get a 10% discount on top of whatever the price is right now. And of course, we'll send a link as part of the post-session emails with the slides and everything. So it's an interesting 2 days. I love to teach this class. I don't know, maybe it's related to the fact that I helped create it. And I hope to be back. It's a bit after the foliage season, right? It's not going to be too crazy here. That's the plan. But don't tell it to people that we're selling this class to from outside the state. We'll tell them it's going to be foliage. You're going to enjoy it. So no. Yes. So we had this discussion. Are there months where the oysters aren't good? In the rest of the world, if there isn't an R in the month name, you're not supposed to eat seafood. But it's not like this in New England, right? We haven't encountered this here, and in Boston as well. So But October has R, so there would be good oysters. Yes, and lobsters. I think it's time for more questions. We've had some questions along the way, but I'd love to address any questions or thoughts that you have. We have around 17 minutes for it, but I'm not in a rush. The oysters will wait.
Thank you very much. The presentation was great and enlightening. I manage software development for a consulting company downtown, and we have been doing Scrum for 5 years, and we are just looking and developing a feature at the feature stage of a product using Kanban. And one of the things that I was missing with Kanban that I had with Scrum was something you touched on, how to do estimates 2 months, 3 months out without wasting too much time doing estimates. And with Kanban, they say, don't worry about it. You've got your lead time, and you've got, you choose an MVP, and you have all the stories for that MVP. And so if you know your throughput, your lead time, hey, you know what you're going to do. But the problem with that is that means that your MVP, when you start off, you have to have all of your work completely broken down and ready to go. Whereas with Scrum, we have an idea of that iceberg principle where, you only break stuff down as you need, but you can put that 100 points on that story and kind of still know that, yeah, it's going to be about 3 months before the MVP is done. I'm kind of at a loss for how do you get that kind of semi-long-term planning without story points?
Awesome question. So the way I do it with my clients, Siemens, they're building products for the biggest auto industry manufacturers. They need to know when things are going to be delivered. They used to use just Kanban without any Scrum. Obviously, we needed some planning there. So the approach we use there, as well as in other places, is kind of similar to the Scrum approach. But basically what we said is, okay, at the team level, we're going to count stories, count PBIs. At the release planning level, what we'll do is we'll ask a question along the lines of, okay, when we look at this feature, Big Rock, Epic, whatever you want to call it, let's create some size on it. What's the size that makes sense? The size that makes sense is how many PBIs or cards or stories do we believe we'll eventually have to break this one into? We don't have to break it down right now, just relative estimates. Use planning poker if that's what you like, use affinity estimation, whatever. Chinese elephant, whatever. There are multiple techniques. There are 5 names for one technique when people look at estimation. But the important point is, try to think about how many cards would this reflect later on. And that's what we did. We broke things down into these sort of features, put these numbers on them. And eventually, if you use Jira or any sort of Agile tool afterwards, basically what this means is for the smaller units, you just put 1 on them. That becomes your story point. You just don't worry too much about how many stories is each one of the items at the team level. The team level, you don't need to do this estimation. At the release level, assuming that you need to predict at that level, or that you need to evaluate the value of something versus its cost, you need to do something like this. There are some controversial thoughts. Daniel Vacanti has a very controversial article about the fact that actually we're clueless when we're estimating value on features. And when you look at the actual uncertainty of estimating value, all of those techniques for estimating value and doing weighted shortest job first and those things, waste of time, you don't really improve the results. It's controversial thinking. I don't necessarily agree with all of it. It's very interesting. Maybe you can get him here one day. I think he likes oysters as well. Yes?
I got to speak to the mic. I probably should have asked this earlier, but underlying your descriptions of the process flows and everything is this unit called a product backlog item, or PBI.
Mm-hmm.
How important is it, in your opinion, that that's well defined, like meets some criteria like invest, independent, negotiable, estimatable, all that?
So there's the professional Scrum with Kanban, or even the Scrum Guide position on this, which is we don't prescribe that you need to do this. And there's the practical side, which says, okay, what will happen if you don't? You would not have a good flow if things keep going back and forth, or if things start and then become black bananas. A lot of the times, when something becomes a black banana, the problem is that you started it when you didn't have a full kit to start it. So, pragmatically speaking, I'm a big believer in making sure that things are ready enough. They don't need to be, bulletproof. It doesn't have to be, perfect. There's another problem with development teams that say, yeah, this isn't good enough, we're not going to start it. Work on it some more, Mr. Product Owner or Mrs. Product Owner, and then we'll start it, because we're not going to change it along the way. That's a team that isn't very agile. That's a team that is using Scrum and Invest and definition of ready to avoid being agile. Does that make sense? Yeah. Ian.
So let's assume we have this team, right, and they're really embodying their principles, right, and they're really great at sizing their work really small. Their cycle time is like less than a day on their average PBI, right, and they're really embodying DevOps culture and tooling, and they're technically enabled to be quote-unquote agile. So what is the value of the iteration at this point in the sprint? How is it not just an arbitrary time constraint at that point?
So let's revisit what's the value of the sprint. So,
I'm not saying the value of the ceremonies within the sprint. I could see why you might still want to retrospect if that's not ingrained in your
okay.
culture. I can see why you still have a stand-up, if that kind of...
So what's the question?
So why would you...
So there's a retrospective, there's a review, there's planning. Those make sense. That's what you're saying.
Why are you trying to still determine how much work we can do in a given time period anymore?
Ooh, I might not be.
Yep.
Maybe it's not important. But maybe it's more important to create a goal that we're focused on. Maybe by discussing this goal and taking, a system thinking approach, stepping away for a second, looking at the bigger picture, just the next 2 weeks, bigger picture, not, months. There's some value in that we might not get on a day-to-day level. But it doesn't have to be heavyweight. So one of the slides that I actually kind of skipped through was the sprint planning slide, and it actually has a work of art on it. Maybe this is what we should hang in the living room, right? Yes, of course. You don't necessarily need to plan out the whole sprint. Focus on a sprint goal and a couple of items to start. And you can begin unplanned work halfway through the sprint. Use the sprint goal. Can work flow across sprint boundaries? Oh, that's a Scrum grenade. I throw it into the room, and then we can all have fun talking about this, and we will not finish at 7. The short answer on this is, as an exception, items could cut across sprint boundaries, but think really deep about why is that happening. So I'm okay with, one item crossing, cutting across once in a while, especially if it's an item that started late. But why did we start it late? Could we have done something else in that time? Maybe refine some more, maybe do some, infrastructure improvement to try to learn something, maybe help some other things. Some cases, it might actually make sense to start an item and work through the sprint, especially if you're an amazing team that has strong continuous integration, continuous deployment, source control capabilities. There is no problem for the team to create an increment based on all of those things, even though this item is in flight. If that's all true, maybe it's not such a big deal to have an item cutting across. When you're a team at that level, you don't care so much about this as your increment. Each one of those smaller elements becomes an increment. But it still makes sense to have the cadence. We're human beings. The week makes sense. We have a start for the week, an end for the week. When it doesn't look that way, when we have to work into the weekend or start to work early in the weekend, we kind of feel awkward about it. We need this rhythm.
So I've seen teams get stuck as part of the rhythm, right? Like, so let's say we execute in a 2-week sprint. I've seen teams get stuck with like, okay, now we're going to try to release every 2 weeks at the end of our sprint, right? That makes sense. But then getting them to go beyond that becomes a challenge. You know, so you could reduce your iteration size, but ultimately, you know, if we want to get them to a place where they're deploying so frequently that it's on a daily basis, what's your thoughts on how that fits into the Scrum, the framework?
It fits perfectly well. Nothing in Scrum says you can't have daily increments. Scrum says you need to have an increment at least at the end of every sprint. At least. You can have as many increments as you want throughout the sprint. And if you look at the theory that Scrum implements, empiricism, having multiple increments inside the sprint, that's amplifying your transparency and ability to inspect and adapt. Why would Scrum be against something like that?
Yeah,
and it's not.
You would agree as a Scrum Master, we should coach
Yeah.
teams to try to help them not focus on releasing at the end of every sprint, but try to,
We should, as Scrum Masters, we should work with our teams and organizations on releasing as frequently as makes sense in order to improve the empiricism of our process and learn faster what's working or not, and deliver value to our customers as quickly as possible. I'm totally on board with that. Yes.
Thank you. So there is a unicorn in the company that I work at called Scrumban, but I've never seen a practical application of it, so it's always a little ambiguous as to what it is. But it sounds like it's just taking the things that work about Scrum and the things that work about Kanban and putting them together, which sounds like what you've been talking about since 5:30.
Yeah. 5:35, but yes.
So is this that unicorn?
Well, I don't see it as a unicorn because I've seen it often enough that it's not, but yes.
Okay.
Definitely. Now, it's a whole different discussion whether Scrumban is a name that makes sense or not. A lot of people, when they look at Scrumban, they look at the process of moving away from Scrum towards Kanban. There's even, well-known practitioner from around here that, is helping drive that sort of thinking. So I've used Scrumban for a while as a name. I don't use it that often anymore. It's Scrum with Kanban. Professional Scrum with professional Kanban. Last question?
So you mentioned WIP limits, so work in progress, and putting limits on that. What about like limits to your backlog?
So that's why I like to use work in process. Because when you say work in process, then immediately you ask yourself, why not limit the amount of stuff that's in our backlog? Now, in the funnel that we didn't even look at, probably yes, because if you have an old boss of mine, he was leading the test director, the quality center group at HP. He was big shot at HP. He called it the defect cemetery. When you're not limiting work in process or defects or PBIs in your backlog, it's becoming a cemetery. So limit the amount of items there. Limit the amount of items that you're refining. Limit the amount of items that that you have in your refined, ready backlog before you sprint. Limit the amount of work throughout your valley stream, not just the work that is in progress in the sprint. So think work in process. It makes more sense. Maybe now that it's on, being recorded, I can show it to Daniel and convince him. Probably not. Probably not. I'll find something that he wants, and I'll give him what he wants, and then we'll get it. Good. So what do we do about those guides? Do you want to go grab them? Yes. My wife would go grab them from the car. Green bag. Green bag. Thank you, Vered. So I'll be here until she arrives, and we can do more questions if you want, or you can go eat more pizza. I don't know. Any more questions?
I thought I heard you say something to the effect of that you don't need to put. I thought I heard you say earlier that you don't need to put tasks under PBIs. Is that? Did I mishear you, or is that?
I kind of said it. I kind of believe it. According to the Scrum guide.